I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you. Well, welcome back to another episode of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club. We have another two-for-one deal going on. We will have Misty Simon on the show, but first, we will have Amy Stewart.
Amy Stewart is the New York Times bestselling author of 10 books, including Girl Waits with Gun and the rest of the Cop Sisters series, which are based on the true story of one of America's first female deputy sheriffs and her two rambunctious sisters. The books are in development with Amazon Studios for a television series. Her popular nonfiction titles include The Drunken Botanist, Wicked Plants, and Flower Confidential. While they have not been adapted for television, there are a few bars around the world named after the Drunken Botanist, which is even better. She lives in Portland with her husband, Scott Brown, a rare book dealer. They own an independent bookstore called Eureka Books, which is so independent that it lives in California while they live in Oregon. Her latest Cop Sisters book is called Cop Sisters on the March. It's the 5th one in the series. It is expected to publish on September 17th of 2019. We're pleased to have Amy Stewart with us. She wrote the Cop Sisters Mystery Series, and we would love for you to tell us more about yourself.
Sure. Before I started writing these novels, I'd read a bunch of nonfiction. I wrote a book called The Drunken Botanist, which is about all the plants that we turn into alcohol. And some people in the crime fiction world know a book I wrote called Wicked Plants, and its sequel, Wicked Bugs, because it was about poisonous, deadly, dangerous plants and insects. So I'd written a bunch of nonfiction before I stumbled across this true story about the Cop Sisters. And I'd been wanting to write fiction for a while, but when I found this story, I really fell in love with them and thought, all right, I'm not going to let anybody talk me out of this one. I'm going to do it.
We're really happy you did. We really enjoy these books.
Well, thank you.
You said you stumbled upon them. How exactly did that come about?
Well, actually, I was working on my previous book, which was The Drunken Botanist, and I was writing about a gin smuggler named Henry Kaufman for The Drunken Botanist, and I just wanted to know what else he'd done before I decided whether or not to tell his story in Drunken Botanist. I went to the New York Times archives, just as a place to start, and found a lot of people named Henry Kaufman in the 1910s who got up to all kinds of trouble. But one of them was this guy in Paterson, New Jersey, who ran his automobile into a horse and buggy being driven by these three sisters, Constance, Norma, and Florette Kopp. And he destroyed their buggy, refused to pay for the damages. It turned into this big conflict to the point where the sisters were getting shots fired at their house and kidnapping threats, arson attempts. It was just like they'd gotten into a car accident with the wrong guy. But that moment proved to be really transformative in the lives of these three sisters. I'm not giving anything away. This is not a spoiler because they put it right on the back of the book. Constance went on to become a deputy sheriff as a result of her work on this case, trying to deal with this guy who was harassing them. And she went on to have this amazing career in law enforcement. And in years to come, books that I haven't even yet written about them, all three sisters get involved in crime fighting and detective work in different ways. And I just thought, this is such an amazing story, and there's something so kind of Hollywood about it. Like, this should be a novel, and it should be not just one novel, but a bunch of novels, and it's all true. Like, it all really happened. I just loved that right off the bat and knew I had to do it.
Well, I have to tell you that how we discovered your books, we are a member of another book club that is held at our public library called Mysterious Minds. Your books were last month's selection. We all started reading them and we said, oh my goodness, we have got to have Amy on the show. We just had the meeting last Wednesday, and we very rarely all agree, but everyone loved the books.
Oh, that's great. Were you reading the first one? Did you start with Girl Waits with Gun? Or?
They gave us a choice to read any of the selections.
Oh, wow. I love that. I do a lot of Skype chats with book clubs and a lot of library book clubs, especially. It's so much fun for me to talk to people who've already read the books, because then we can really get into a lot of stuff that you can't get into otherwise.
The moderator said that she had noticed that on your website, and she was like, oh, I missed an opportunity. So maybe for your next book.
Yeah.
Since you're writing this book as basically fiction, but it's based on real facts, how much of Constance is real and how much of her is fiction?
You know, everything is real to the extent that I know about it. If it happened, I work really hard to try to include it. There's very little about their real lives that I've left out. I change as little as possible, and I always do these historical notes in the back, and I explain what I changed and what I didn't. But in the case of Constance in particular, I know so much about her. She was in the papers. I have photographs of her, long interviews, so I have her speaking in her own words. For instance, I know that she was the oldest of the three sisters. She was about 35 when all this started. She was 6 feet tall and weighed 180 pounds, which at that time, in the 1910s, she would have been a very large woman. The average height of a man was only 5'7", 5'8" for World War I. So she towered over everybody. I know it's a fact that she wanted to go to school and wanted to have a career. She didn't want to get married and settle down and have kids, but her mother kept her from getting an education. So you can imagine how she must have felt. At the age of 35, there she is living at home with her family, no really prospects for her future. Not married, no family. Like, what does the future even hold for her? And then this thing happens that completely changes her life and makes her actually a national celebrity. I mean, these stories about her and her sisters, they ran in the paper all over the country, in El Paso and California, everywhere.
That's amazing. And the time frame is exciting one in women's history because they are entering the workforce in ways they hadn't before, like Constance becoming a police officer. And they are on the cusp of getting voting rights. So that kind of leads us to our next question. Will they get involved in the suffragist movement?
You know, it's so interesting. Here's the challenge with historical fiction. Of course, I want to bring in the big historical events of the time that everyone thinks about, like women's suffrage. But I want them to talk about those things in the way that people actually would have talked about it at the time, as opposed to them having any kind of awareness of how momentous it really is now. Do you know what I mean? I don't want them sitting around having conversations like, I think it's so unfair that we can't vote.
Yeah.
That would kind of ring a little false, I think. When you think about how we talk about current events now, there's a lot that we probably kind of leave out and skip over because we're all marinating in it all the time. There's a lot that we don't have to say. It's been an interesting question, like how to deal with that. And so it comes up. The fact that they can't vote comes up in small ways, but I just sort of let it go by. I don't dig into it a lot. The activism that was happening with suffrage movement overlaps so much with World War I. You know, World War I kind of overtook the suffrage movement in a way and overshadowed it and was really, I think, the primary preoccupation for so many people. So yeah, it's interesting figuring out how to balance all that. But I mean, I don't have them going to Washington and petitioning to speak to President Wilson or anything like that. Mostly because they're so busy doing what they were really doing.
Well, I can imagine that each of them would have different viewpoints on, well, any subject for that matter. But I can see Norma kind of like shouldn't have to worry about that. Florette not really worrying much about it. She's rather flighty. But Constance being interested in getting the right to vote.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that they all wanted to vote. But you're right that there were women who didn't. And it's so funny for us to imagine that today. But there were definitely women who thought, that's our husband's realm and we have our realm and let's leave it that way.
I'm curious how you approached writing these books because they were all based on real things that happened. Did you take those events and then just fill in the blanks, or how did you do that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I try to do. I try to take the real events and fill in the blanks with fiction. The moments where I don't know what happened or why it happened or who did something, that's where I have to invent something. But it's one of the things that I think makes these books sort of straddle the line between crime fiction and historical fiction is that the structure of each novel is different because of the events in their real lives. You know, our real lives don't follow a 3-act plot structure in the way that we expect a novel to. I'm always trying to stick to the truth as much as possible, but also remember that people expect a story to kind of go a certain way. But, you know, like they're not whodunits because that's just not what Constance did. We're never going to see them stumble across a dead body on page 10 and we find out who did it by page 300 because in real life, as far as I know, that never happened to them. It's interesting trying to figure out how to take the real cases that Constance was working on as deputy sheriff and to mold them into the shape of a novel where there's a question at the beginning that gets answered by the end. That's really my approach with all these books.
Well, for your 5th book, we heard that it was loosely based on Bill Murray's movie Stripes. Can you elaborate on that?
I will elaborate on it. So here's what happens in the 5th book. The 5th one, which is called Cop Sisters on the March, is the first of my 2 World War I books. I don't know what the Cop Sisters were actually doing in World War I. Between the first book, Girl Waits with Gun, and this 5th one that's about to come out, these are books about Constance's work as deputy sheriff and the cases she was working on and the reasons women got arrested, and Constance is running the women's section of the jail, and she's doing law enforcement work, and they are books about a woman in law enforcement. But then here comes World War I, and I have about 2 sentences that give me any clues about what they were doing during the war, and it's just not enough. So I'm free to invent. And so I went looking for, what did women do during World War I? There's a story that I think hasn't been told enough, which is the story of the National Service Schools. These were military-style training camps for American women who wanted to help somehow with the war effort. And this was not something that the military set up voluntarily. Women had to really push and agitate to get these camps created, and basically ended up doing it on their own because the War Department was completely uninterested, but finally had no choice but to pay attention because women were coming by the thousands to train. So I thought, well, this is amazing. It was covered a lot in the papers. There's good documentation. So I'm going to send the Cop Sisters to one of these camps. And that gives me a way to tell the story of these camps, which I find so interesting, even though they didn't in real life ever go there. So I'm thinking about okay, what is this novel going to look like? How's it all going to work? There's another real life person that I want to have showing up at the camp whose story I also really wanted to tell. And her story begins with her almost one day losing her job, her boyfriend, and her apartment. And then she sees this enrollment station for the National Service Schools and she decides to join up. And I'm thinking about how I could get that scene to play out. And I was like, that is the opening of Stripes. I don't know if you have this movie memorized the way I do, but when I was a kid, it was on cable every day, and I watched that movie so many times. And in the opening scene, Bill Murray's a cab driver, and in one day, he loses his job driving his cabs, he loses his girlfriend, and he loses his apartment, and he sees a commercial on TV about joining the Army, and he decides to join up. I just thought that was kind of funny. It's not at all a literary movie. If you wanted to do a literary novel based on a Bill Murray film, you would, of course, do Groundhog Day, which we all because we respect that movie. Nobody has any respect for Stripes. I don't know that they should, but I did. Once I realized that opening scene was the same as Stripes, I was like, you know what? There's actually a couple other things that are going to happen in this book that could happen in the same way they did in Stripes. Partly just a coincidence, but I think it's also partly just the setting, basic training in the Army versus this National Service School. There's just certain things that are going to happen, and I could make them a little bit the same. So it's one of those things that probably only entertaining to me, but I don't know. If anybody else had the experience of watching Stripes as many times as I did, they will laugh a couple times in the movie. They'll be like, oh, I see where she got that.
I think you did such a good job in the books leading up to this, and I'm sure with this one too, that you weave in a little humor in there, and you probably feel like you know these girls so well that it was probably easy for you to write a book on what they did, even though you know it didn't happen.
Sure. And I mean, that of course is the work of most novelists. It's just the fact that I'm so used to being able to follow true events that it's a little bit of a departure for me. But yeah, I think I know them really well. I got to tell you, writing comedy or writing humor is probably the hardest thing to do. I like that they're sort of lighthearted. There are definitely things in every book that make me laugh out loud. Whether they make other people laugh, I don't know. They're not super dark books because I'm not a very dark person. Also, the world is a pretty dark place, and I sort of like to escape from that. They tend to be kind of lighthearted. It's not a serial killer on the loose and he